Deep in a rainforest in Thailand, a single ant leaves its colony's foraging trail, something worker ants almost never do alone. It climbs a plant stem with no apparent hesitation, stopping at a very specific height, roughly 25 centimeters off the ground. It clamps its jaws down onto the main vein on the underside of a leaf, in a grip so strong it will remain locked there long after the ant is dead, and then, over the next several hours, it dies exactly where it bit down, because something else decided it should. That something is a fungus, and what it does to this ant isn't a horror movie premise. It's one of the most thoroughly documented examples of behavioral control in the natural world, and biologists have spent decades trying to understand exactly how it works. The fungus is called Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, and its target is almost always the same: carpenter ants living in dense colonies on the rainforest floor. Infection starts small. A single spore lands on an ant's exoskeleton, and using a combination of mechanical pressure and enzymes, it works its way through the ant's outer shell and into its body. From there, it begins to grow quietly inside a living host that has no idea anything is wrong yet. For the first several days, infected ants behave almost completely normally. They forage, they interact with the colony, they carry out their usual tasks. This matters because it means the fungus isn't just attacking, it's waiting, growing through the ant's body while leaving its day-to-day behavior mostly intact, so the colony has no reason to notice or intervene. Then, at a certain point, everything changes at once. The infected ant starts to move differently. Its walking becomes erratic, uncoordinated, and it begins to wander away from the trail network the colony relies on. This is the first outward sign that something in its nervous system is being overridden, and it leads directly into the strangest part of the whole process. The ant doesn't just wander randomly. It heads toward very specific conditions: a height, a temperature, a humidity level that happen to be exactly what the fungus needs in order to reproduce successfully later. For years, the assumption was that the fungus was physically invading the ant's brain, essentially rewiring it from the inside like a biological puppeteer pulling strings directly. More recent research has actually complicated that picture in an even stranger way. When scientists examined infected ants closely, they found that fungal cells spread extensively throughout the ant's body, through its muscles, its abdomen, its legs, but largely avoided actually penetrating the brain itself. Instead, current evidence suggests the fungus surrounds the brain and may be releasing chemical compounds that hijack the ant's nervous system from the outside, effectively controlling the body's muscles directly while leaving the brain physically intact, almost like a puppeteer controlling limbs without ever touching the puppet's head. That distinction matters because it reframes what's actually happening. This isn't simply fungus eats brain, it's something closer to full-body remote control, executed with a level of precision that looks less like random parasitic damage and more like a targeted behavioral program. And the precision doesn't stop at getting the ant to climb. The final bite, the one that locks the ant's jaws into the leaf vein, happens at an extremely specific time of day, usually right around solar noon, when temperature and humidity conditions in the understory are at their most favorable. The height the ant climbs to isn't random either. Researchers have found that infected ants consistently die within a narrow band of height and microclimate conditions that maximize spore dispersal once the fungus finally fruits. Too low and spore dispersal is limited. Too high and the temperature is wrong for the fungus to develop properly. The ant, without knowing it, is being walked to the exact coordinates that work best, not for itself, but for something else entirely. Once the jaws lock, the ant dies, still gripping the leaf. Over the following days, a stalk begins to grow out of the back of its head, the fruiting body of the fungus, which will eventually rupture and release spores down onto the forest floor below, directly onto the trail where the ant's former colony continues foraging, completely unaware that they're walking through a minefield seeded by one of their own former workers. Ant colonies haven't stayed defenseless against this. In colonies that have coexisted with Ophiocordyceps for a long time, worker ants have developed the ability to detect infected nestmates, sometimes before obvious symptoms even appear, and physically remove them from the colony, carrying them away from the nest and dumping them at a distance, or in some cases directly attacking them. It's a form of collective immune response happening at the level of the whole colony rather than inside a single body, and it's one of the clearest examples examples in nature of a society adapting its behavior specifically to contain a parasite that manipulates behavior. What makes this story land the way it does isn't just the horror movie mechanics of it, it's the questions it raises that go beyond ants entirely. This fungus demonstrates, in astonishingly precise detail, that a nervous system can be overridden from the outside without destroying the part of the brain we'd assume decisions come from. The ant's brain, by most measurements, was still there, still largely intact, right up until the end. Its behavior wasn't. That's the part researchers keep coming back to, because it raises an uncomfortable question that goes well beyond ants. How much of what looks like a decision in any organism is really coming from the part of the brain we assume is in charge, and how much of it can be quietly rerouted by something else without ever announcing itself? And once you start looking for this pattern, ants turn out to be far from the only case. Parasites that manipulate host behavior are more common in nature than most people realize. The zombie ant fungus just happens to be the most visually dramatic example. Take the hairworm, a parasite that grows inside crickets and grasshoppers. Once it's ready to reproduce, it needs to get out of its host and into water, where it actually mates. The problem is, crickets don't voluntarily walk into ponds, so the hairworm produces proteins that interfere with the cricket's central nervous system, and infected crickets start doing something they'd normally never do, actively seeking out water and jumping in, essentially drowning themselves, at which point the worm, which can grow to several times the length of the cricket's own body, exits into the water to continue its life cycle. The cricket gets nothing out of this arrangement, it's simply the vehicle. Or consider Toxoplasma gondii, a single-celled parasite that can only sexually reproduce inside a cat's gut, but which spends part of its life cycle inside other animals, most famously rodents. Toxoplasma-infected rats and mice show a change in behavior that looks almost too convenient to be a coincidence. Healthy rodents have an instinctive, deeply wired fear of the smell of cat urine. Infected rodents lose that fear. In some studies, they're actually drawn toward it. That's exactly the outcome that benefits the parasite, since a rodent that wanders toward a cat instead of away from one is a rodent that's more likely to get eaten, delivering the parasite straight into the only host where it can complete its reproductive cycle. What's made Toxoplasma particularly controversial in recent years is the question of whether it can do anything similar in humans, who are also capable of carrying the parasite, usually through undercooked meat or contact with cat feces. Several studies have reported statistical associations between Toxoplasma infection and subtle changes in human behavior and risk-taking, and some researchers have gone as far as linking it to differences in personality traits or reaction times. It's important to be careful here. Correlation research like this is notoriously difficult to interpret, and plenty of scientists remain skeptical that the effect, if it exists at all in humans, is anywhere near as dramatic as what's seen in rodents. But the fact that the question is even being seriously studied says something about how far this idea has traveled, from a fungus in a rainforest to a debate about human psychology. Then there's a parasite that might be the strangest of all, Leucochloridium, a flatworm that infects snails. Once inside, it grows into the snail's eye stalks, swelling them up and pulsing with bright striped colours that look almost nothing like a normal snail, and, critically, changing the snail's behaviour so that it moves toward open, well-lit areas instead of staying hidden in the shade the way snails normally do. The transformed eye stalks look remarkably like caterpillars, wriggling conspicuously in plain sight, which is exactly the point. Birds mistake them for prey, eat them, and the parasite completes its life cycle inside the bird, the only host where it can reproduce. The snail survives the initial attack, in many cases, only to be reinfected and sent out again. What ties all of these cases together, from the ant to the cricket to the snail, is the same underlying strategy. A parasite that can't get where it needs to go on its own borrows a host's legs, or wings, or instincts, and quietly reprograms just enough of its behavior to do the traveling for it. None of these hosts are choosing any of this. From the inside, as far as anyone can tell, the behavior probably still feels like their own. That's really the uncomfortable center of this whole topic. We tend to think of behavior as something that comes from a single unified will, sitting somewhere behind our eyes, but biology keeps turning up examples of that will being quietly overridden, rerouted, or replaced. Not through obvious force, but through subtle chemical signals a host's own nervous system was never built to defend against. The ant walking to its exact, precise death isn't an outlier. It's a particularly visible example of something that may be happening in smaller and less dramatic ways throughout the natural world far more often than anyone's comfortable admitting. including possibly in ways we haven't yet found the evidence for in ourselves.